I am happy that joining me to talk about the role of local news in a democracy is pioneer journalist Jocelyn Dorsey. At WSB-TV, Jocelyn became the first African-American news anchor in the Atlanta television market. She later spent more than 40 years as the director of editorials and public affairs at WSB-TV. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Donna.
I'm excited about this conversation. So I want to start this conversation on local news with a quote from Walter Cronkite, who said, "Journalism is what we need to make a democracy work." And I would argue if that is true, then local news is the foundation of that, because it's where we live, it's our community, that kind of thing. How would you respond to that?
Absolutely. But before we go there, I want to let people know that this is a topic that I had to research, because everybody assumes that we're experts in everything.
We just do it.
And I wanted, for full transparency, because we talk about sources, I wanted to at least talk about where I got my information, because it's a tremendous piece. And that was from the University of North Carolina and the Hussman School of Journalism and Media. It did over 100, maybe almost 200 pages of research of what this was all about. And I certainly learned a lot, although, you know, there were some things that I suspected and I knew, but this certainly confirmed the information that I'm about to disseminate to everybody. So, and forgive my notes, because I want to be accurate, and there's some real details in here that I would like people to know. But when you talk about local news, think about it. I mean, when you wake up in the morning, what do you say? How are my kids going to school? What's the weather going to be like? Is the traffic going to be bad? And those are things that you normally don't have to worry about, at least in the metropolitan Atlanta area, because you have local journalists to tell you how to do it. There are people who are doing things all across the country, and very creative things. I'll give you a couple of examples. In New Jersey, journalists have created a map to help families find meals. In North Carolina, journalists and community organizers created a phone tree to help people check on their neighbors. In Detroit, reporters are texting safety information for people who don't have wireless access, and the list goes on and on. But you must understand, during COVID, a lot of people talk about first responders and essential workers that have lost their jobs. Journalists have lost their jobs as well. There's like 36,000 journalists who have lost their jobs across the country, and I thought that, you know, that may be something that people need to know. And 30 states have determined that journalists are essential workers. So when you look at, you know, what's happening across our country, and this was happening in addition to what's been happening historically. And so despite the efforts of other media, I'm going to talk about newspapers primarily, because 85% of the information that we get comes from newspapers. But television is trying to make up the void, but they really can't do that. And social media is also trying to make up the void. And so while they try that and the best that they can, television viewers have also declined. And when you look at what's happening across the country, why is this? And why have newspapers fallen by the wayside? The interesting fact that I found, I should ask you, why do you think? Take a guess.
Why have newspapers?
Newspapers.
It has to do with advertising dollars.
Craigslist.
That's it.
Craigslist. Can you believe it?
Classifieds.
Right. Classifieds. People don't realize that classified ads were the way that newspapers derive most of their revenue. And Craigslist, there was a study done between the years of 2000 and 2007 that Craigslist cost newspapers $5 billion in advertising. So when you look at that, and it's still, if you look at, they're saying that if you look at within 10% likelier that a newspaper will fold if Craigslist is within 30 miles of that location. So isn't that fascinating that, you know, this is what has changed the landscape? And then you have to take into the fact that news has also declined on television, but guess what? Television gets most of their news from newspapers. I mean, you know, I know people don't want us to admit that, but they absolutely do. And so to look at what's happening in radio and all of those areas are declining, that, you know, the real value of real news we're losing.
Yeah, and I would contend at the local level that the newspapers are your connection to your community. It is your connection to your neighbors. It's your connection to your schools. It's knowing about what's going on just right in your neighborhood first. And without that local news, you don't get any of that. I've always loved little small papers, like when we were growing up, where we'd be able to see our names and our pictures in there. You know, I was a candy striper, and I was in a newspaper, and that was a big deal. And I think the sad part is people have lost a lot of that. When news goes away at the local level, you lose that.
And it's so funny you mentioned that, because those were exactly the things that I was going to mention. The one big thing, though, is that, you know, the newspapers in the past 15 years, 50% of the audience is gone from newspapers. And even of the 6,700 newspapers left, they're a shell of what they were before. I'm going to talk a lot about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, because initially in this research I found that there was a lot of reference to the Journal-Constitution. But, you know, the bad part is that we probably won't ever go back to where we were in newspapers. So we're going to have to look at how things have changed and what are we going to do to accommodate local news. Because in the absence of local news, what you are having is what the previous conversation was about, and that's fake news. You get the social media, you know, viral news goes faster, 10 times faster than real news. And that's the danger that, you know, we're already becoming a polarized society. And with news now as fake news, and we're not being able to determine it and not having that local voice, I think we're going to be polarized even more.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the coronavirus. Early on, though, in the coronavirus, when we all shut down, it was the local news that people had to rely on. You didn't know what was going on with your neighbors. Thinking back on it, was kind of a surreal time. We were all in our homes, and the only thing we had to reach out to was the newspaper or what was on television to know what was going on. So that's the irony of what went on with the pandemic. Of course, as things started opening up, we realized that newspapers and television lost advertising dollars. We've seen layoffs, we've seen furloughs, and salary cuts in the news business, and they've just gone by the wayside. And do you think the average person recognizes the fact of recognizes what they've lost in local news over the last few years, even not just the coronavirus proved to be the end for a lot of places, but it's devastating. Been declining.
I mean, people may not realize the impact because some of it is so subtle. I mean, we talk about the fact that, you know, we're not going to see the high school football scores, and we're not going to see, you know, who was in the play, obituaries, marriages. I mean, really the local news operations were the ones that kept the public record of a city, of a community. And that's what's lost is, you know, you don't have reporters sitting in courtrooms and listening to judges, and you don't have them, you know, phoning in police beats. And you just keep going down the line, you know, who's looking after the nursing homes, who's looking after the police. And those things are so important in local communities that people are missing that. But the other thing too is when you look at political candidates, and you look at who's running in these local races, because most of even television can't cover all the local races that are going on. It's those local newspapers and those local outlets that give you the information so you can decide on who to vote for. And that's one of the things that I think's important. And what we have are a lot of news deserts, what they're talking about. And so, you know, they're not covering the school boards. They're not covering any of this. And so what happens is you get people who are crooked and who are so glad that there is no reporting of local news. And then and that feeds into corruption. So, you know, subtly what will happen is you'll have corruption taking place. And there's an interesting study. I have to tell you this because I thought this was very important. Economists at the University of Chicago and Notre Dame have shown that even the cost of municipal borrowing increases significantly when local newspapers shut down. According to their survey of 1,596 English language newspapers serving some 1,266 counties at some point between 1996 and 2015, whenever a local newspaper closed or reduced publishing to fewer than 4 days a week or was absorbed by another news outlet, municipal borrowing rates, that is the cost of municipal bonds, increased within 3 years by 5 to 11 point basis. And that's a significant rise in municipal bonds. They found that in 300 instances in which newspapers merged, downsized, or died, it led to substantially higher borrowing costs. And then newspapers also affect a city's payroll. A lot of people don't realize that. The median county saw its total government wages raised by $1.4 million a year after a local newspaper closed. Not only did the number of government employees increase, individual taxpayer bills rose on an average of $85 a year, and local governments appeared to be less efficient. They increased their employee base. I mean, the list could go on and on and on.
And most of this is because there's no watchdog.
Exactly.
Wow.
Because that is the mission of local news, is to be a watchdog for the government. And when you don't have that, and you find that, you know, the social media may take it up, but it's really just a blip in the radar. It's not the resources that they have to have reporters who are actually sitting in all of these sessions and listening and digging. And then there's one other thing that I thought was interesting, and we'll go to that later, but talking about the role of newspapers, especially the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. A lot of people don't realize the Constitution, well, the Atlanta Journal and Constitution were two separate newspapers until 2001. The Constitution was a morning and the Journal was...
I didn't realize it had been that long, actually.
Yeah,
it seems like it was just yesterday.
I know. Well, I've been around a long time. But the Constitution was a morning paper, and it was a bit more liberal, and the Journal was a bit more conservative. And it was one of the first, the Constitution was one of the first Southern newspapers to really report the civil rights movement in a very objective way. The newsrooms were operating separately, but this attracted the attention of the nation when the AJC was reporting what was going on in the civil rights movement, and they won Pulitzer Prizes after Pulitzer Prizes for what was going on and shaped the debate. When you think about it, they shaped the debate of the politics of the South and made an impact and a difference in ways that we will never know. Well, we do know, and we can certainly appreciate. But now, look at it this way. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 1996 circulated in 124 counties of the 159 counties in Georgia.
Wow.
Now it's only 32 counties.
And I want to get to some more of those news deserts, because we have something we're going to show up the screen from the University of North Carolina's Hussman School of Journalism, where they talk about the news deserts, and they looked at Georgia and drilled down on things. And that map shows that of Georgia's 159 counties, 28 of them don't have a newspaper, and 112 of them only have a single newspaper. And that's a decrease of 21% between 2004 and 2019. So this isn't new, but it is continuing to happen, and coronavirus kind of just shut it down for a lot of places.
And the impact can be dramatic. One of the recent stories that I think will surprise people, well, that won't surprise people perhaps if they think about it, but it was the Brunswick News wrote this article in May of 2020, and it was the Poynter Institute's media critic, Tom Jones, who really brought this to the forefront of the glaring desert, the news desert, and what could happen in a news desert. And that was, why did it take so long for Ahmaud Arbery and the shooting in Brunswick, Georgia, to surface to the national level? Think about that.
Right.
It was months. One of the reasons was that, it was reported in the local Brunswick paper, but nobody picked it up.
Right.
And it wasn't until the Atlanta Journal-Constitution picked it up. Jacksonville was closer. AJC is 300 miles away from Brunswick. The only thing, one of the things that they cover, and they don't have a bureau, and so what they really only cover is weather and climate conditions. And so the Jacksonville papers and TV stations, which are closer, didn't pick it up. So it wasn't until the AJC picked it up, and subsequently the New York Times picked it up, that it became a national story. The Brunswick Reporter said that the biggest thing that helped that story was the fact that the AJC and New York Times had reporters who could dig deep into the story, and they had the resources to really get to the surface of what was going on. And the Brunswick only had 4 reporters for the whole paper, so they couldn't expend the resources to really do the digging that was needed for that case.
And Brunswick had a newspaper, and we're talking about all the deserts of news that don't have anything like that, and that you have journalists who were trained to understand to do that, to know what to do at the AJC and the New York Times. It's amazing to think about that. We've got to talk about something hopeful before all of this is over. We've talked about the consequences, we've talked about limited access to local news and all, but are there some solutions? Are there some alternatives? Something we can feel good about? Please.
Yes, there absolutely are. One of the things we'll talk about the politics. The UNC, I couldn't even go into the political aspects of what's going on in local news and how many bills there are in Congress. The UNC has a list of all those bills that are pending in Congress and ideas that are pending before the FCC about what to do about local news. But they're hoping that Congress's newfound discovery of what's happened in light of COVID is going to really help give support to local news organizations. The hope is that, it could happen, but this is an election year, and so nothing may happen until January. One of the interesting things is, though, that news advocates are also saying that we need to look at public broadcasting and the fact that very little public broadcasting is devoted to covering local news. And so they want that paradigm to shift. So that's another thing that people are talking about.
We want that to happen. And we could go on and on about this. We thought this segment, we weren't going to have enough to talk about. There was so much to talk about. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for digging into all of that and being who you are, your insight tonight, your contributions to journalism. We appreciate you too.